right, so we are good to get started here. As soon as I'm not stuck, there we go. All right, so last time we had just finished off, we were talking about sort of which is preferred or which is most effective punishment or reinforcement. And then we wanted to talk, and then we talked very briefly about shaping and chaining as two different processes that could be used. And then we were going to move on and start talking about extinction. And so operant extinction is very similar to what we've already discussed for classical conditioning in terms of extinction, where we're going to eventually have a weakening and disappearance of a response. So in classical conditioning, extinction was happening because our conditioned stimulus was no longer paired with our unconditioned stimulus. So that's when we were ringing the bell, but no longer giving the dog food. So as those are unassociated, we'd see less of a salivation response. For operant extinction, it's kind of the same idea, but instead now it's the operant response. That behavior is no longer followed by that outcome or consequence. But we have a couple of differences here. So the first of these is the fact that we see what's called an extinction burst. So this is a temporary increase in responding once extinction starts. So if we are looking at a rat pressing a lever, and every time they press that lever, they get food. All of a sudden, pressing the lever no longer gets them food. So they're going to press the lever a bunch of times because they want to get it working again. So we can start seeing emotional and even aggressive responding as they press the lever more and more to see if it'll give them food. Kind of like if you're using a vending machine and it eats your money. So it's doing something it's not supposed to. You don't get your desired outcome. So you might aggressively shake the machine. So we could call that an extinction burst. But after this, your responding will eventually stop if it's not effective. And if we wanted to look at what this might appear to be, this kind of looks like the graph we looked at for classical conditioning extinction. Along the bottom, we have time. Here it's in days instead of trials, but that's not a big deal. And then on the side here, we have our, we're looking at text messaging frequency for this one. So the example here is, say you're sending a friend texts, and they would usually respond to you. So you typically send them 4 texts, you get some texts in response. So during the reinforcement stage, you send texts and receive texts as per normal. But when extinction starts, they stop responding to you. So we would actually see that if they don't respond, you would probably send more texts than normal. Hey, what's going on? Why aren't you responding? Maybe you'd even start getting angry at them that they're ignoring you. So maybe you send way more texts than usual. But if you're still not getting a response, eventually you're going to stop sending text messages because you're not getting a response, so you're just going to stop trying. So that's what that would look like, where we have that extinction burst where you have more intense responding at first, and then it trails off down to none. And this could be rats pressing a lever, it can be people responding to text messages, it can be sort of any of our operant behaviors, whatever we choose to look at in terms of operant conditioning. The next thing I want to talk about is the idea of a discriminative stimulus. And this is actually just a proper name for something we've been talking about already. So a discriminative stimulus is a stimulus that signals the availability of reinforcement. So I've mentioned a cue light. When we have our operant conditioning boxes, we would have a red light in the box. And when the light is on, it means that the animal could do a particular response to get a particular outcome. We're telling them that it's set up so that they could run a trial if they wanted to. When that light is off, it tells them that even if they do the response, the system's not ready, they can't get that outcome. So it's a stimulus that tells us what the conditions are right now. Will you get reinforcement or not? What's going to happen? So it's something that gives us that extra information. It allows us to discriminate between times when we would get our reinforcement and times when we would not. And while we're here, we can also talk very, very briefly about the concepts of generalization and discrimination. And I mentioned when we first talked about generalization and discrimination back in classical conditioning that we were looking at sort of amount of responding there in terms of their conditioned response. So how much is the dog salivating to a particular sound or to particular frequency? Or how much of a startle response is being produced. If we change the label on that axis to how much of our operant response is being done, we would have the exact same pattern. So if we're looking at a situation of generalization, we would see very high levels of operant responding to whatever stimulus they are supposed to be responding to. So if we had our sort of vertical versus diagonal versus horizontal lines, like in our previous charts, we would see the highest levels of responding to the vertical line that they were used to. And then if you tilted that line, made it horizontal or sort of diagonal, I guess, then you'd probably still see some responding. And if you still see fairly high levels of responding, we could say that they've generalized and are responding to the diagonal line very similar to how they responded to the vertical line. If we see one of those more steep charts, one of the diagrams, graphs is the word I'm looking for, where we see a big drop off in responding, where we see very high levels of responding to that vertical line, but as soon as it tilts off the vertical, we see much less responding. That's still discrimination. So it's still the same basic setup. We're just talking about either an operant response or previously our conditioned response. So we can tell if it's operant discrimination or generalization versus classical conditioning, generalization and discrimination, just based on what kinds of activities we're talking about. Okay. And then the next thing to mention is just another little bit of terminology that we can discuss. So we've been talking about things that are reinforcing, but we haven't given them a proper term. And I don't know how proper of a term it is, but you can also call this a reinforcer. So any stimulus or event that follows a behavior that increases the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future, that would be a reinforcer. So food is a fantastic reinforcer. So if a rat presses a lever and gets food, and it makes that rat more likely to press the lever in the future, we call food a reinforcer. And specifically, we would call food a primary reinforcer, or an unconditional or an unconditioned reinforcer, if we're making our parallels back to our classical conditioning. And so by saying that it's unconditioned or unconditional, we're saying that they don't have to learn anything about it. A rat is going to be motivated by food because food is innately motivating. Food is something that you want. You don't have to learn to want food, it just sort of comes naturally. So if it's something that you don't have to learn about, we call it a primary reinforcer. So things like food and water are fantastic examples of primary reinforcers. We can also have what are called secondary reinforcers, and we could call these conditioned or conditional reinforcers as well, just to imply the fact that you need to learn something about them. So they are not innately reinforcing, but we can come to associate them with something that's reinforcing. So money is one of the best examples of a secondary reinforcer. So money itself, the pieces of paper don't necessarily mean anything, but you learn that you can use money to get things. You could use money to buy food, so you can use it to go and get primary reinforcers. So it itself is not primarily reinforcing, but we've learned that it can be reinforcing, so we call it a secondary reinforcer. And we can use very similar concepts with punishment. So we can have a punisher, and I suppose technically you could have a primary and secondary punisher, but we typically don't delve too much into that. I've already kind of hinted at the fact that we're going to focus mainly in on reinforcement from here on out, and specifically you might have figured almost exclusively positive, there we go, the other P, positive reinforcement. So we're mostly going to talk about you do something and you get food. So you get something good that makes you more likely to do a particular action. We can set these things up to look at other kinds, whether it's sort of positive, negative, reinforcement, punishment, but for ease of concepts and the fact that there are a lot of terms to wrap your head around this semester, we stick to our positive reinforcement pretty much exclusively. Okay, our next big topic are schedules of reinforcement. So this is another thing that we've kind of been ignoring so far. So we've mentioned that, okay, the rat presses the lever and they get food, but we haven't specified, is it every time that they press the lever? Is it only sometimes? And for learning, it absolutely matters how often pressing the lever is associated with getting food. So we, of course, have names and specific terms to talk about different situations when that reinforcement would be delivered. So what we've been talking about so far would mostly fall under the category of continuous reinforcement, where every time you make the response, you get reinforced. So you press the lever, you get food every single time. That's continuous reinforcement. We can also have partial or intermittent reinforcement, and this is when only some responses are reinforced. So maybe a rat gets food every second time they press the lever, or maybe every 10th time. And you can think about it, in the real world, we typically don't get reinforcers for absolutely every action that we do. Maybe when we're children, we're nice because our parents told us that it was good to be nice and they gave us praise for doing something good. But as we get older, we don't need to be told that it's good every single time. We're still going to do it. So that would be more of a partial reinforcement. So in the real world, we can encounter a lot more partial reinforcement than continuous. So let's break down these partial or intermittent schedules of reinforcement. And just like when we were looking at our positive and negative, punishment versus reinforcement, for this we're going to have two big questions that we're going to ask, and then we can combine the answers into 4 possibilities. So the first question, is this fixed or variable? Is the situation sort of solid and predictable, or is it something with a little bit of variability, with a little bit of wiggle room to it? So the first option is, if it's fixed, then the reinforcement will occur after a fixed number of responses or after a fixed amount of time. So if we say that the rat gets food every 10th lever press, that would be a fixed schedule of reinforcement. Or if we say that after 10 minutes, the first time they press a lever after 10 minutes, they get food, that is also fixed. But if we have that wiggle room introduced, if we have some variability, we can have variable reinforcement. So reinforcement occurs usually after an average number of responses or an average amount of time. And we'll usually see this reported as the rat receives food on average after 10 lever presses. And then there's usually brackets that say plus or minus a certain amount. So if we say 10 lever presses plus or minus 4, that means that the rat might get food as soon as 6 lever presses in. Or they might have to wait as long as 14 lever presses in. So because of that sort of span, because it's not a hard rule, we call it variable reinforcement. Okay, so that's our first question, fixed or variable. Next we ask, is it ratio or is it interval? Basically, is it looking at number of lever presses, or is it looking at amount of time that has passed? So ratio is dealing with number of responses. So it might be reported as a percentage or specifically a ratio. So 1 out of 10 responses are reinforced. Usually we're going to say after a certain number of lever presses. That would be our ratio. And then for intervals, it's usually the first response after a certain amount of time has elapsed. So maybe the first lever press after 10 seconds or after 10 minutes or whatever interval we choose. Okay, so we're going to ask fixed or variable. And then we're going to ask, is it ratio or interval? And then we can combine that into this diagram here, where we have our 4 possibilities. If we have something that is a fixed interval, we're saying that after a set amount of time has passed, the rat will be reinforced for pressing the lever. So after 10 minutes have elapsed, the first time they make a response, they're going to be reinforced. With our fixed ratio, we're looking at number of responses. So it's fixed again, but it's number of responses. So after 10 or on the 10th response, every 10 responses, there will be reinforced. For our variable intervals, that's when we would have sort of a span. So we're looking at time, and we have sort of plus or minus a certain amount of time. So 10 seconds plus or minus 2 seconds. And then variable ratio would be a set number of lever presses plus or minus some kind of range. So variable ratio is 10 lever presses plus or minus whatever number, 2 or 4 or whatever. So if we introduce a range or that variability, we're looking at variables. If it's something that is a single sort of time or number, that's going to be fixed. And then if we talk about time, it's interval. If we talk about just quantity or number, then it's ratio. Okay, and so each of these different types of reinforcement actually produce different patterns of responding. So we can actually look at this diagram here, this chart that has on the bottom here time, as per usual with our graphs. And then on our vertical axis, on our y-axis, we have cumulative number of responses. So this is just a running tally of how many times has the rat pressed the lever. So we can start with our variable ratio or VR schedule of reinforcement. So variable meaning that there's a range. We don't know exactly when we're getting reinforcement. Ratio telling us that we're looking at the number of times we've pressed the lever. So they're getting reinforced every 10 lever presses or so, plus or minus maybe 4. So sometimes after 6 they're going to get food, sometimes after 14 they're going to get food, and the rest of the time somewhere in the middle. And so when we're looking at this diagram here, the little tick marks that come off the side, each tick indicates when reinforcement was delivered. So when did the rat get food? And then we can look at the slope of our line, and that would tell us how many times is the rat pressing the lever per unit time, because we're looking at cumulative number of responses or lever presses by time. So the slope is just the interaction of them. So the steeper that slope, the faster the rat is pressing the lever. So for our variable ratio line, we see that it's a straight line. And it's fairly steep, and this kind of makes sense. So the rat is pressing the lever, so the rate that they get food at is completely dependent on how quickly they press that lever. But also, they don't know when, after they receive food, they'll get their next exposure to food. So they're motivated to press the lever very quickly, but also to constantly press it, because we can see some of these lines are pretty close together. Sometimes they get food very, very close together. So they were lucky and they got it right after, one after another. So that would kind of motivate them to keep pressing. So we see a very straight line because they don't know when the next food is coming, and it's a steep line because it's dependent on how quickly they press the lever. So the next one over, our blue line, is for fixed ratio. And this line looks very, very different. So ratio means we're still looking at number of lever presses, but now it's fixed. So if a rat gets reinforcement, and it's, say, the standard, every 10th response they get food, if they just got food, they know that they have to press that lever 9 more times before they'll get a trial that's reinforced. So they know that once they've gotten food, the next press is not going to have food, nor is the one after. So we see after each tick kind of like a plateau, that little step pattern, where they stop responding for a little while. And it's because as soon as they get food, they know for sure they won't get food the next time. So we see this pretty nice step pattern where they're going to wait for a while before they start responding again, because they don't want to keep responding if they know they're not going to get food. If we move on to our green line for variable interval, Having a variable again, where we have that wiggle room, gives us another straight line. So if we see straight lines, we assume variability. But this time it's interval, so it's based on the amount of time that's passed. So this isn't related directly to how many times the rat presses the lever. So they're not really motivated to sit there and press the lever constantly. What's determining when they get food is how much time has passed. So we tend to see a much shallower slope because they're not being pressured to push the lever all the time. And again, we can see that our tick marks, some of them are closer together, some of them are further apart, showing that variable nature. So if we don't know when we'll get it next, we're going to respond at a pretty consistent rate, but we're not as motivated to go quickly because it's not based on lever presses, it's based on timing. And then our last one is our fixed interval. So this is every certain amount of time that has elapsed. The next time we press the lever, we get food. And we see an interesting scallop pattern here. So this is based on timing. So it's not going to be we're not sort of motivated as aggressively as we are with our ratio options. But we also see that right after they respond, so after they get food, there's a trailing off in responding. But it's not a hard step like we see with our fixed ratio. Instead, we see a curve up to the next time they get food. And what's causing this is actually the fact that most animals are just really bad at keeping track of time. And that includes humans. You get this exact same pattern with humans too. But if you tell someone that they can't go outside until 10 minutes have passed, if they don't have a watch, they're going to wait and ask, has 10 minutes passed? And at first, you know that you just asked and they said 10 more minutes. So for the next little while, you know that you shouldn't ask. But as we get closer and closer to 10 minutes, you're like, well, maybe it's been 10 minutes. I'll go check. So I'll press the lever and see if I get food. And then as you get closer and closer to that time, they tend to test it more and more often, hence that sharp upswing on the graph. And then as soon as they get food, as soon as they receive their reinforcer, then they're going to stop responding again. So we tend to see this scalloped pattern just because they don't know when enough time has passed, and they increase their responding as we get closer to that time period. So you could, from just patterns alone, tell the difference between all 4 different types of responding. For our variable ones, it's kind of hard. You'd have to have a comparison, where the one that has a steeper slope would likely be your ratio, and the less steep slope would be the interval. But anything variable is a straight line. Fixed ratio is a sort of a hard step. And then our fixed interval is our scalloped pattern. And we see this across multiple species in a lot of different scenarios. So this is a nice general graph to know. Okay, and of course, this is the point where we ask, well, which one is the best method? Which one should we be using? And as always, the answer is it depends. So it depends on what you're aiming for. So if you're looking for really rapid learning, if you want something to be associated very, very quickly, continuous reinforcement is your best course of action. And so we could, this is probably a good point to note, that continuous reinforcement could also be called a fixed ratio, where you are reinforced every 1 trial. So it isn't technically like a 5th category separate from. You could lump it in here properly under fixed ratio of 1. But I find that kind of silly, especially where it has its own term. But I mentioned it to another class, so I figured I'd mention it here as well. But that continuous reinforcement, getting food every single time, leads to much faster learning. And that's because it's a lot easier to realize the connection between doing that action and getting that outcome. Pushing the lever gets you food every single time. So it's a lot easier to associate that behavior with the consequence. But our problem here is you now expect to get food every single time. And even a single trial with no food would trigger our extinction process. So we'd start seeing that more rapid responding from an extinction burst right away. Because when you have a very obvious pattern of every single time and it suddenly doesn't happen, you're going to know right away. But any of our partial or intermittent reinforcement processes, not getting food on a given trial, isn't really unheard of. Every single one of those partial reinforcement schedules has a situation where you press the lever and don't get food. So extinction's a lot harder to notice. So in any of those situations, you actually persist a lot longer through extinction because it's a lot harder to tell from the normal operation. Our downside here is that we learn a lot slower because you're not getting that pairing of the response and the outcome as often. So you kind of have a trade-off there. And at the bottom, this is sort of a visual representation of how it gets difficult to tell an intermittent reinforcement schedule from extinction. So if we look at the green as when you get food, continuous is it's always green, you always get food. Intermittent is sometimes it's green, so sometimes you get food, sometimes not. And then extinction is getting into it's rarer and rarer to get food. So especially in situations where we have variable schedules, so when there's that unpredictability, it becomes much harder to notice extinction because maybe you're just really unlucky and you're on one of those higher ratios or longer intervals from that average that's been calculated. So it's a lot harder to identify extinction. And specifically, variable ratio schedules are the most resistant to extinction. So if you want something that's going to persist for longer, variable ratio is the way to go. And on Friday, when I talk a little bit about working with chickadees and doing operant conditioning in chickadees, I'll actually mention the fact that we transition from continuous reinforcement to partial reinforcement. We actually start them on continuous reinforcement because it takes them a long enough time to learn that we want to push that learning as quickly as possible. And then we transition them to a point where not every single trial is reinforced because we want to get them used to the idea of having trials that don't produce reinforcers. So I'll talk about why we do that, but just to let you know that you can start mixing and matching these depending on what your goal is for your research. All right, and so that is the end of operant conditioning. And so this is a great place to take a moment and talk about how do we tell the difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So this is a really useful table. There's also a video there. I sometimes show it in class. I'm not going to this time. You can watch it on your own if you'd like, but it's just a comparison of classical conditioning and operant conditioning by someone who uses a slightly different explanation than I do. So sometimes that's helpful for people. But this chart is a great place to start because it gives us some key points and we can ask some questions to determine, is a situation that I'm looking at operant conditioning or is it classical conditioning? So the first thing we can consider is what stimulus is controlling this process. With classical conditioning, everything is being run by our conditioned stimulus. So we are focusing in on the dog learning to salivate to the bell. So ringing the bell produces that conditioned response. In operant, we're focusing in on our discriminative stimulus, that antecedent, the thing that tells us that we could respond to get the outcome. When we're looking at what behavior are we learning, in our classical conditioning, we're looking at things that are elicited, something that is involuntary. So the dog doesn't choose to salivate, it happens automatically. So it's something that's occurring without sort of conscious involvement. And then with operant, the learned behavior is something that is evoked, something that is voluntary. So the rat makes a response. They press that lever. They don't automatically press a lever. There's some kind of decision process going on there. In terms of an important stimulus, so what are we learning about or what's driving the learning? Our unconditioned stimulus, the food, is really important during classical conditioning because that's what we already know something about. So we're going to pass that knowledge on to another stimulus. In operant conditioning, it's our consequence, our reinforcer, or our punisher. That is the thing that teaches us whether we should be doing that behavior more or less. for the first of our questions, we can say, okay, well, does this behavior change the likelihood of the consequence? And that's something that ties very specifically to our operant conditioning and specifically our law of effect. So we were looking at, okay, if I do this behavior, then that outcome will happen. But in classical conditioning, we don't focus in on that. So if we're talking about, okay, doing this behavior leads to that particular outcome, then it's operant conditioning. We can ask, what are we learning? And in classical conditioning, we're just looking at the relationship between our conditioned and our unconditioned stimuli. So we're associating those two different stimuli. In operant, we have our antecedent behavior consequence, or our stimulus response outcome trio of things. So we would learn those three items together. And then our last question is, can it add a new response to our repertoire? For classical conditioning, we started with a dog that was salivating to food. That was something that they did naturally. And we're just getting them to salivate again in a new scenario, to a bell now instead of just food. So we're not introducing a new behavior. We're not introducing a new response. It's the same thing, just in a different place. But in operant conditioning, we can have new responses. So now they're going to press levers or push buttons or peck keys. So we're starting to see new behaviors introduced. So if we're starting with just sort of an existing behavior and that existing behavior is happening in a new situation, it's probably Pavlovian or classical. And if we're learning something new, it's probably operant. So you can run through all of these questions to help you figure out which is it, operant or classical conditioning. Okay, and then for the last part of the chapter, I want to get us through our topic of social learning. So what happens when we start introducing more of the cognitive process? So you might have figured out that everything so far, we've been focusing in on the environment. How are we interacting with our environment? What are we learning from our environment? What are we getting from stimuli and interactions and all of that? And we've mentioned a couple of sort of thinking or choosing to respond, but we're trying to avoid some of that terminology because our behaviorists, and especially our radical behaviorists like Skinner, really ignored any cognitive aspects that might be involved in any of those processes. But social learning is going to do the opposite. This is when we're going to say, let's lean into that cognition. Let's lean into what's going on internally. And so our big name here is Tolman. So Tolman said that our explanations for behavior should include more than just environmental stimuli, and they should deal with more than just publicly observable behavior. So we've been focusing on what things in our environment are driving this relationship and what behaviors are we producing. And they're always something that we can observe, that we can document, that we can monitor. But Tolman was saying, well, what about what's going on internally? What about what's going on in our heads? What about things that are that we're learning about that we're not acting on? And so this sort of led to our cognitive psychology push. And so one of the biggest concepts here is the idea of latent learning. And this is when we learn something, we learn a particular behavior, we learn a particular response, but we don't actually demonstrate knowing that response until there's reason to demonstrate it. So until we're motivated or reinforced to do it. And most of this was studied using the idea of cognitive maps. So cognitive maps are mental representations that we create in our minds, and we can use them or recall them to improve our ability to navigate. So let's look at an example of how they were studying latent learning using these maps. So here we have a series of sort of intersections. These are kind of like multiple T intersections. So when you study rats, and specifically when you study decision making in rats, they have lots of T mazes, which are, as they would sound, you run down a hallway and then you're faced with a T intersection. And you can turn left or you can turn right. And so this is just multiple T intersections where there's a correct way to turn and an incorrect way to turn. So if you turn the correct way, then you continue through the maze. If you turn the wrong way, you hit a dead end. And so Tolman had set up a bunch of these kinds of T mazes, and they gave some rats the ability to wander around the maze, but with no motivation to find an exit. They were just given the chance to explore the environment, but there was no reinforcer for escaping from the maze. Rats like tunnels, so there was no reason for them to want to be out of the maze. So that's the position at the beginning where they're given the opportunity to learn about that environment. And if cognitive maps are a thing, then maybe they develop some kind of internal representation of the maze. Then they would introduce reinforcement. So what if we put food at the end? What next? Do the rats that had the prior experience now perform better than rats with no experience? So if we have rats that were able to wander versus rats that hadn't wandered, which ones get out of the maze faster? And the ones that had the previous experience, they performed faster. They would escape much faster overall. So that's giving us evidence that there was latent learning because there was no real performance shown until they were motivated to leave. But also, we get to see that cognitive maps are probably something that's going on because they successfully turned in the right directions at the right intersections, having made that sort of internal representation of the environment. So that was one of their really strong proponents or support for those two concepts. Our next big name here is to talk about Albert Bandura. And Albert was actually from Alberta, which I always remember now because of his name. It didn't mean anything at all to me until I moved to Alberta, but there you go. But Bandura studied kindergarten students to try and establish a concept of observational learning. So if we think about how we learn to do things, we do have some classical conditioning where stuff happens automatically. Scary movies are scary because they have things in them that we associate with being afraid. We also have our operant conditioning, where because our parents tell us that we should or should not do particular behaviors, we're going to do some things more often than others. But that's not the only way that we learn. We also look at other people. We also watch what other people are doing and follow their lead. For myself, my most recent example of this was the first day back after they reopened campus. I wasn't quite sure how to get into the buildings, so I waited and watched for a minute. I watched somebody else get to the door and was like, oh, okay, that's where you go in. I'm going to do that too. So that would be an example of social or observational learning. So I understood what to do because I watched other people do it. And we could also call this vicarious conditioning, specifically if we are learning about a particular behavior, if we watch another organism, a model, being conditioned. So if we have a rat, so we'll have actually two rats. One is an observer rat and one is a model rat. The model rat is in an operant conditioning box. So the model rat presses a lever and gets food. The observer rat can watch this interaction and potentially learn that pressing the lever gets you food. So the idea would be if they've learned something just from watching, that observer rat should figure out pressing the lever to get food a lot faster than a rat that has no experience with levers. So we can actually test that. And that is something that happens in a lot of different behaviors, surprisingly. So if we wanted to talk about the different phases of this observational learning, we can break it down into paying attention, where your observer, here it's called the learner, the one who's watching and learning, will watch the one who's doing the task. So our model, or the trainer, the one who's showing off a behavior. So step one is your observer paying attention to the model? Are they watching the scenario? Step two is retention. So we would have our model do the behavior. And then theoretically, our observer would think about the response. They would sort of watch what happens and think about what went on. So they'd have to make some kind of logical connection between pressing that lever and then getting food. Step 3 is when they actually produce that behavior. So production is when our observer would be given the opportunity to demonstrate the modeled behavior. So we put that observer rat into an operant box and expose them to a lever. Do they press it or not? And then motivation is what comes afterwards. So if they press that lever, they would receive their food reinforcer. So they imitate that behavior and it gives them reinforcement, which makes them more likely to do it again in the future. So we could see how this could almost help us shortcut classical conditioning. We wouldn't have to go through shaping because they learned it from watching. And they'd start doing that behavior fairly quickly, and they seem to have a good grasp on, yes, pressing this gets us that. So this could be another way of sort of demonstrating that knowledge has been passed on. If this is something you're interested in, I have worked with someone at the U of A, the Guillet Lab. They do observational learning in zebra finches as they build nests. And so they have zebra finches who watch other zebra finches build nests. And they will pay more attention if they're watching successful nest builders. So if they raise young and do a good job, then they're more likely to copy their behaviors. But it's really neat because you get this observational learning where they hold on to that knowledge for weeks or months or even years before they can use it, which is very cool. Huh. Yeah, probably. Or like there are other factors that might be involved, but yeah, if set up that way, I would call that observational. There's a lot of debate as to whether you can have a model of a different species, and there's some really cool research coming out with sort of interspecies learning, which is really cool. I think the most recent stuff I've looked at is like dolphins learning from humans, which is amazing, but a very fun and upcoming area. And it's very rare in like most species, so it would be very rare to see like a cat learning from a squirrel or something like that. So humans have some weird interactions where species will pay attention to us, but there's all sorts of moving parts to that. Like dogs have a predisposition to pay attention to humans, mostly because they've been selectively bred to pay attention to humans. But we can see it in other species too, which is just really neat. But yeah, very, very neat topics. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about are mirror neurons. So this is sort of our physiological example of our setup to copy people. So these are neurons that are activated both by performing an action and seeing another perform that action. So this would be like if we're monitoring your brain and the same part of your brain lights up when you're riding a bike, but also when you watch someone else ride a bike. They're not that complex. They're sort of a newer topic that's being discussed, and they're mostly studied in, say, non-human animals. So there's lots of research in rats and monkeys. So it seems to be a little bit less complex than that. So it would be something like when they're facing in a particular direction or when they move in a particular way. But that's the same idea where it's us performing an action and someone else performing that action are both linked to the same part of the brain, which is kind of cool. So it's like we're set up to learn by watching others, and we can kind of imagine doing it ourselves because of some of these setups. All right, and then of course we can't talk about observational learning without talking about one of our famous psychological studies. You may have heard of the Bobo studies. So this is some nightmare fuel if you've never seen this before. But they have what are called Bobo dolls. You might have had these as kids, maybe also called Weebles, where they're heavily weighted on the bottom and they rock, but they don't tip over, so they'll always right themselves because they have heavy weight at the bottom. So So they have these blown up dolls that are, for whatever reason, made to look like clowns. And they had adults who would model behavior of interacting with these dolls. And specifically, we were interested in aggression. So what happens if children were watching an adult walk up to this doll and punch it? What would the children do? And how would that change if the adult was either encouraged to be aggressive or discouraged from being aggressive? So if the children watched an adult punch the doll and the adult was told, "Good job," the children would be very eager to get in there and punch the doll themselves. And if you look closely at some of the images in here, these kids went like absolutely mad attacking these dolls. There are some very interesting interviews and chats about this study if it's something you're interested in. But it showed us that they were very quickly copying behavior of adults. So it's a good evidence for this observational learning. We are also going to briefly refresh our concept of biological preparedness. So we mentioned this earlier on with classical conditioning, where it's easier to condition particular stimuli to particular responses. We saw that it's a lot easier to associate tastes with feeling ill and physical stimuli to feeling physical pain. It's also a lot easier to learn that spiders and snakes are scary than neutral stimuli. So we have these biological sort of predispositions where certain types of stimuli fit together. And this also works for things like operant conditioning. So if we think about the fact that when you perform a response, you get a particular outcome. So maybe that your outcome is getting food. Do you then start associating food with some of the earlier steps? And the answer is yes, which is shown hilariously by an example of trying to operant condition a raccoon to drop money into a piggy bank for a commercial. So they were training a raccoon to take coins, put it in a piggy bank, and they would get food if they did it. But what do raccoons do with food? They rub it together. So once they started associating the coins with getting food, they could no longer separate that concept of food, and they treated the coins like food. And so they stopped dropping it in the piggy bank. They would hold on to them. So we have to watch out for some of these biological constraints because it can be more difficult to teach certain things, or it can even get in the way and prevent us from learning certain things, which is really fun and interesting from different points. And then our last slide to finish up here is about learned helplessness. And this is when you experience an aversive stimulus that you can't control. So if you learn that something bad is going to happen and there's nothing you can do to escape it, so if we think of our escape and avoidance behaviors, if you learn that there's nothing you can do to escape or avoid it, you stop trying to escape and avoid it. And learned helplessness actually sort of extends beyond that, where once you've learned to not try and escape, even if the opportunity to escape comes up later, you usually choose not to take it. So a lot of the studies have looked at this in different animals, say getting away from a light shock or a loud sound. Once they've learned that they can't get away from it, they won't try to get away, even when there's an opportunity. And so there's a lot of research looking at how this compares to things like depression, where once we've learned that anything we do isn't helping, we stop trying. And then even if there's a new opportunity, we might not take it because we've learned not to bother. So there's a couple of different ways to get around that, depending on what the situation is. But another thing of interesting and upcoming research that could be neat in the next couple of years. And so that is the end of this chapter. As I said last time, my intention is to now spend Friday to chat about actually doing operant conditioning in a lab. I'll talk about my own research, and then if we have time at the end, we'll just chat about any concepts people want to go over before the midterm. So if that's something you're interested in, you can come in for that. And then if not, then you don't have to be here, and I'll see you on Monday for the exam.